Before diving into this forgotten nightmare of Byzantine brutality, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden horrors of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the shadows that lurk behind every throne. Now, you might be wondering why you've never heard of Michael VII and his systematic torture of his own siblings. After all, history loves a good monster. We remember Caligula's madness, Nero's fires, Ivan the Terrible's rages. So why has Michael VII been scrubbed from popular consciousness like blood from marble floors? The answer lies in the very nature of his crimes. Most tyrants torture their enemies, their subjects, their rivals for power. Michael tortured the people who shared his blood, his childhood memories, his mother's womb. He turned the most sacred bonds of family into instruments of political control, transforming love into terror with a sophistication that would make Machiavelli weep with admiration. But Michael's story doesn't begin with screams in palace dungeons. It begins with something far more ordinary, far more human. It begins with a mother's desperate love and the impossible mathematics of imperial succession. Eudokia Makrimbalatisa had given birth to 4 sons, each one a potential emperor, each one a threat to the other's survival. In the Byzantine Empire, there was no neat line of succession like in England or France. The throne belonged to whoever could seize it and hold it, which meant that every prince was simultaneously heir and enemy to every other prince. Michael was the eldest, born in 1050 AD during the height of Byzantine power, when Constantinople was still the jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire. His brothers Constantine, Andronikos, and John followed in quick succession, each birth celebrated with ceremonies that masked growing anxiety. How do you raise 4 boys to love each other when you know that 3 of them will likely die violent deaths? How do you teach them brotherhood when the very existence of siblings threatens their future? Eudokia tried everything. She made them sleep in the same chamber until they were teenagers, forced them to share tutors, insisted they participate in joint religious ceremonies. She commissioned frescoes for their nursery depicting famous brothers from scripture and legend, hoping that images of Castor and Pollux, of David and Jonathan, might inspire fraternal devotion rather than fraternal murder. For a while, it seemed to work. Court observers noted how the 4 princes moved through the palace like a pack of wolves, finishing each other's sentences, sharing private jokes, defending one another against criticism from tutors and courtiers. Michael, as the eldest, naturally assumed leadership of this little confederation. He was described by contemporary chroniclers as Pos. But there was something else, something that evanescing, unusual intelligence, a gift for languages, and a magnetic personality that drew people into his orbit like iron filings to a lodestone. Those who loved him couldn't quite define. A coldness behind his eyes when he smiled, a calculation in his generosity, a quality that made servants uncomfortable even as they praised his virtues. The first crack in the brotherly facade appeared in 1059 AD, when their stepfather, Isaac I Komnenos, abdicated the throne unexpectedly. According to have passed to Michael as the eldest son, but Isaac, perhaps to Byzantine law and custom, the crown was sensing something troubling in his stepson's character, Doukas, who prompt instead transferred power to his friend. Constantine adopted her 4 boys, giving them hastily married Eudokia name and his protection. This adoption should have solved the succession crisis by placing all 4 brothers under the authority of a strong emperor who could manage their competing ambitions. Instead, it created new roars beyond imagination. Constantine Thex tried to treat problems that would eventually explode into whore all 4 boys equally, granting them titles, estates, and positions at court that reflected their new status as imperial princes. But Michael, now bearing the name Michael VII Doukas, never forgave what he saw as the theft of his birthright. In his mind, he had been emperor for 9 years, from 1050 to 1059, even if he'd been too young to rule. The crown belonged to him by divine right, and every day that passed under Constantine's rule was another day of illegitimate usurpation. His brothers, perhaps sensing the dangerous currents swirling around their eldest sibling, began to distance themselves subtly. They formed their own alliances within the court, cultivated their own supporters, prepared their own claims to eventual succession. This gradual separation of the brothers created exactly the dynamic that Eudokia had feared. Instead of four princes united against external threats, she now had four princes maneuvering against each other within the palace walls. Michael watched his brothers' growing independence with the cold attention of a snake studying mice. He began keeping detailed records of their activities, their friendships, their private conversations. He cultivated informants among their servants, their tutors, their companions. He turned gathering intelligence on his own siblings into a science, documenting their strengths and weaknesses with the thoroughness of a general preparing for war. When Constantine the X died in 1067 AD, the succession crisis everyone had been dreading finally arrived. Eudokia, now Empress Dowager, faced an impossible choice. Tradition and law suggested that Michael, as the eldest adopted son, should inherit the throne. But Michael was only 17, legally too young to rule without a regency, and his brothers were even younger. The empire needed strong leadership to face external threats from the Seljuk Turks, the Normans in Italy, and various Balkan tribes who sensed Byzantine weakness. After months of deliberation and court intrigue, Eudokia made a decision that would haunt her remaining years. She married Romanos IV Diogenes, a brilliant military commander who could provide the empire with the leadership it needed while serving as regent for her sons until they came of age. Michael's reaction to his mother's remarriage was swift and devastating. Within weeks, he had orchestrated a conspiracy among resented the new emperor court officials whose military background and foreign policy priorities. He leaked sensitive information about Romanos's battle plans to enemy agents, sabotaged supply lines for crucial military campaigns, and spread rumors about the emperor's loyalty that eventually reached the ears of the Seljuk Sultan himself. But Michael's most vicious attacks were reserved for his mother. He began a whispering campaign suggesting that her marriage to Romanos was not political necessity but lustful abandon, that she had betrayed the memory of Constantine X for the pleasures of the flesh, that she had sacrificed the empire's stability for her own carnal desires. The psychological warfare Michael waged against his own family during this period reveals the calculating cruelty that would later explode into physical torture. He understood that the most effective way to destroy someone wasn't through direct confrontation, but through the systematic erosion of their relationships, their reputation, their sense of self-worth. He turned his mother's love for him into a weapon against her, playing the wounded son who had been abandoned for a stranger, the rightful heir who had been cast aside for political convenience. Every private conversation between them became an opportunity for emotional manipulation. Every public appearance a chance to demonstrate his supposed suffering. His brothers initially tried to remain neutral in the growing conflict between Michael and their mother's new husband. But neutrality, Michael decided, was the same as betrayal. If his brothers wouldn't actively support his claim to the throne, then they were obstacles to be removed. He began treating them with the same cold calculation he had applied to his mother and stepfather. Constantine, the second eldest, found himself excluded from important court ceremonies without explanation. Andronikos discovered that his personal servants had been reassigned to other duties, leaving him isolated and vulnerable. John, the youngest, began receiving anonymous threats that left him afraid to sleep alone in his chambers. The transformation of Michael from brotherly protector to fraternal predator didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like the slow corruption of meat left too long in the sun. Each small cruelty made the next one easier. Each successful manipulation encouraged greater risks. Each moment of family trust betrayed opened new possibilities for exploitation. By 1071 AD, when Romanos IV was captured by the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manzikert, and Michael finally ascended to the throne as Michael VII, he had already learned to see his siblings not as family, but as political problems requiring permanent solutions. The coronation ceremony should have been a moment of triumph for the entire family. Instead, it marked the beginning of a reign of terror that would make the palace dungeons echo with screams for 7 long years. As the crown was placed upon Michael's head in the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, his brothers knelt before him in submission, unaware that they were kneeling before their executioner. The man who had once shared their nursery, their games, their childhood fears, looked down upon them with eyes that reflected nothing but cold imperial calculation. The boy who had promised their mother he would always protect his younger siblings had died somewhere in the labyrinth of court intrigue and been replaced by something else entirely. Something that understood that true power required the elimination of all alternatives, even when those alternatives shared your blood, your memories, and your name. The first torture session began on a Tuesday in November 1071 AD, exactly 3 months after Michael's coronation. Constantine, the second eldest brother, had made the fatal mistake of suggesting during a council meeting that the empire's deteriorating finances might require reducing the emperor's personal expenditures. It was a reasonable proposal, the kind of practical advice that older brothers had been giving younger brothers since the dawn of time. But Michael no longer heard the voice of a sibling offering guidance. He heard the whisper of a usurper questioning his authority. That evening, as Constantinople's church bells rang vespers across the darkening city, Constantine was summoned to his brother's private chambers for what he believed would be a family discussion about imperial policy. Instead, he found himself facing a tribunal of Michael's most trusted interrogators, men whose loyalty had been purchased with gold and sealed with blood oaths. The emperor sat behind a desk covered with scrolls and documents, his face illuminated by flickering candlelight that cast dancing shadows across features that had once been as familiar as Constantine's own reflection. The questioning began gently, almost conversationally. Why had Constantine questioned the emperor's judgment in open council? Who had encouraged him to challenge imperial prerogatives? What foreign agents might have influenced his thinking? Constantine answered truthfully, explaining that his concerns stemmed from genuine worry about the empire's fiscal health, that no one had influenced his opinions, that his only motivation was the welfare of the state they both served. But truth, Michael had discovered, was less useful than confession. Truth closed investigations, while confessions opened new avenues of inquiry, new suspects to examine, new threats to eliminate. When Constantine's honest answers failed to satisfy his interrogators, the emperor gave a subtle nod to the guards stationed behind his brother's chair. What followed was not the crude brutality of common torturers, but something far more sophisticated, far more personal. Michael had studied the human body with the same methodical attention he had once applied to grammar and rhetoric. He understood which nerves produced the most exquisite agony when compressed, which bones could be broken without causing immediate death, which psychological pressures could shatter a man's will, while leaving his mind intact enough to provide useful information. The torture chamber beneath the imperial palace had been renovated specifically for Michael's purposes, transformed from a simple dungeon into something resembling a physician's laboratory crossed with an artist's studio. Gleaming instruments hung from specially designed racks, each tool crafted by Constantinople's finest metalworkers according to the emperor's precise specifications. Tables could be adjusted to any angle, restraints could be tightened or loosened with mechanical precision, and an elaborate system of mirrors allowed the torturer to observe his subject's reactions from multiple angles simultaneously. Constantine's screams echoed through the palace's lower levels for 3 days and 3 nights. Servants crossed themselves when they heard those cries, recognizing something unholy in their rhythm and intensity. These were not the random shrieks of a man being broken by common criminals. They followed patterns, rising and falling with musical precision, as if the emperor were conducting an orchestra of agony with his brother's voice as the primary instrument. Guards stationed at the chamber's entrance reported that Michael emerged periodically to take meals, to attend to correspondence, to conduct the routine business of empire, only to return refreshed and ready to resume his work with renewed enthusiasm. The information extracted from Constantine during those 72 hours of systematic torture revealed the emperor's true genius for paranoia and control. Under extreme duress, his brother confessed to conversations that had never taken place, conspiracies that existed only in Michael's imagination, plots that implicated dozens of innocent courtiers, servants, and officials. Each confession generated new suspects, new questions, new reasons to expand the investigation. By the time Constantine finally died from his injuries, the emperor had compiled a list of over 200 individuals who required immediate interrogation. But Michael's treatment of Constantine was merely a rehearsal for the masterpiece of cruelty he planned for his remaining brothers. Andronikos and John had watched their sibling disappear into the palace's depths, had heard his screams echoing through the corridors, had seen the servants' terrified faces when they emerged from the lower levels. They understood that their own survival depended on absolute submission to their brother's will. But absolute submission, they would soon discover, was not enough to satisfy the emperor's requirements. Andronikos, the third brother, possessed a quality that Michael found particularly threatening. He was genuinely beloved by the palace staff, the city's common people, and the empire's military commanders. Where Michael inspired fear and calculated obedience, Andronikos generated spontaneous affection through his natural kindness, his quick wit, and his genuine concern for others' welfare. This popularity represented an existential threat to Michael's authority, a reminder that legitimate power could flow from love as well as terror. The emperor's solution to the Andronikos problem demonstrated his growing sophistication in the application of psychological torture. Rather than simply arresting his brother and dragging him to the dungeons, Michael chose to destroy him slowly, publicly, through a campaign of calculated humiliation that would simultaneously eliminate a threat and provide entertainment for the court. Andronikos found himself assigned to increasingly menial tasks, forced to serve wine at state banquets where he had once sat as an honored guest, required to clean the stables where his favorite horses were kept, ordered to scrub floors in chambers where he had once conducted imperial business. The psychological impact of this systematic degradation proved more devastating than any physical torture. Andronikos began to doubt his own memories, his own worth, his own sanity. Had he truly been a prince of the imperial house, or had that identity been an elaborate delusion? The servants who had once bowed respectfully when he passed now looked through him as if he were invisible. The courtiers who had once sought his opinion now treated him like a piece of furniture, discussing his fate in his presence as if he lacked the capacity to understand their words. Michael observed his brother's psychological disintegration with the clinical detachment of a natural philosopher studying an interesting specimen. He took detailed notes on Andronikos' declining mental state, documenting the precise moments when hope flickered in his brother's eyes and the exact techniques required to extinguish that hope completely. The emperor was creating a science of despair, developing methods that could be applied to any future threats to his authority. When Andronikos finally broke completely, babbling incoherently about imaginary crimes and begging forgiveness for sins he had never committed, Michael had him transferred to the same torture chamber where Constantine had died. But this time, the emperor's approach was different, more refined, informed by everything he had learned from his first experiment in fraternal destruction. He wanted to explore the relationship between physical pain and mental anguish, to understand how the systematic destruction of the body could be calibrated to produce specific psychological effects. The torture sessions became longer, more elaborate, more carefully orchestrated. Michael would begin each day's work by reading aloud from Andronikos' childhood diary, which he had recovered from their mother's possessions, mocking the innocent dreams and fears recorded by a boy who could never have imagined the monster his beloved older brother would become. He would describe in loving detail the meals they had shared as children, the games they had played, the promises they had made to always protect each other, turning every precious memory into an instrument of psychological torture. Between these verbal assaults, the emperor would apply physical tortures designed not to kill but to create maximum suffering over extended periods. He had learned that the anticipation of pain could be more effective than pain itself, so he developed elaborate rituals around each procedure, explaining in advance exactly what would happen, precisely how much it would hurt, and why the suffering was necessary for the security of the empire. Andronikos would spend hours chained to the torture table, knowing that agony was coming but not knowing when, his mind fracturing under the weight of inevitable horror. The youngest brother, John, witnessed all of this from his increasingly isolated position within the palace. He watched Constantine disappear and never return, observed Andronicos's gradual transformation from prince to victim to broken animal, and understood with crystalline clarity that his own turn was approaching. But John possessed something his older brothers had lacked: the desperate creativity that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose, and the cold intelligence necessary to turn that desperation into a weapon against the monster who had once been his protector. John had learned to move through the palace like a ghost, avoiding the emperor's attention while gathering intelligence that might save his life. Unlike his brothers, who had maintained their routines until the moment of their capture, John understood that survival required complete transformation. He stopped sleeping in his assigned chambers, instead finding refuge in forgotten corners of the palace, abandoned storage rooms and servants' quarters where Michael's spies were less likely to venture. He cultivated relationships with kitchen staff, stable boys, and cleaning women, people who moved invisibly through the imperial household and saw everything while appearing to see nothing. From these shadow networks, John learned disturbing details about his brother's transformation into something inhuman. The emperor had begun keeping trophies from his torture sessions, preserving Constantine's fingernails in a jeweled box, and wearing Andronicos's signet ring on a chain around his neck like a barbaric charm. Servants reported finding detailed sketches in Michael's private study, anatomical drawings that mapped the human nervous system with the precision of a master physician and the imagination of a demon. The emperor was evolving beyond simple sadism into something approaching scientific inquiry, using his brothers' bodies as laboratories for exploring the outer limits of human endurance. But John's intelligence gathering revealed something even more chilling. Michael's appetite for familial torture was expanding beyond his immediate siblings. Cousins who had never posed any political threat found themselves subjected to increasing scrutiny. Young nephews were questioned about their loyalty with an intensity that reduced children to tears. Even distant relatives who lived in provincial cities began receiving visits from imperial investigators, asking pointed questions about their correspondence, their friendships, their private conversations. The emperor was systematically mapping the entire extended family tree, identifying every individual who shared even a drop of royal blood, cataloging their potential as future threats to his absolute authority. Court astrologers working under imperial commission had begun constructing elaborate genealogical charts that traced bloodlines back 7 generations, highlighting every connection that might theoretically support a rival claim to the throne. Michael was preparing for a purge that would make his treatment of his brothers seem like mere practice exercises. This intelligence convinced John that escape was impossible and resistance futile. The emperor's network of informants had grown too extensive, his paranoia too comprehensive, his methods too refined. Any attempt to flee Constantinople would be detected before he reached the city gates. Any effort to build a conspiracy would be betrayed by spies before it could take meaningful action. Michael had transformed the imperial palace into a perfect trap, and John was the last mouse still running through its increasingly narrow corridors. But if escape was impossible and resistance futile, perhaps there was a third option: surrender. Not the passive submission that had failed to save Constantine and Andronikos, but active collaboration that might transform him from victim to accomplice. John began studying his eldest brother with the same methodical attention that Michael had once applied to studying him. He observed the emperor's routines, his preferences, his psychological needs, searching for vulnerabilities that might be exploited not to destroy Michael but to become indispensable to him. What John discovered was both horrifying and illuminating. Michael's torture of his siblings hadn't been motivated purely by political necessity or sadistic pleasure. It had been driven by a deeper psychological compulsion, a need to prove his absolute dominance over the people who had once been his equals. The emperor's childhood memories of brotherly affection had become sources of unbearable vulnerability, reminders that he had once depended on others for emotional support, validation, and love. By destroying his brothers, he was attempting to destroy the parts of himself that had ever needed anyone else. This insight provided John with his survival strategy. Instead of trying to appeal to Michael's long-dead fraternal affection, he would feed the emperor's hunger for absolute control. Instead of reminding Michael of their shared childhood, he would help him forget it entirely. Instead of positioning himself as a brother seeking mercy, he would present himself as a tool willing to be used in whatever capacity the emperor required. The transformation began with small gestures of submission that went beyond anything Constantine or Andronikos had ever attempted. John prostrated himself whenever he encountered Michael in the palace corridors, remaining face down on the marble floors until explicitly commanded to rise. He began referring to the emperor not as brother, but as divine Augustus, using the most formal court titles even in private conversation. He requested permission before eating, sleeping, or leaving his assigned quarters, turning every basic human function into an act of imperial deference. But John's most brilliant stroke was volunteering to serve as his brother's assistant during the torture sessions that continued with other victims throughout the palace. When Michael began interrogating the cousins and nephews identified in his genealogical purge, John requested the privilege of preparing the subjects for questioning, of maintaining the torture equipment, of recording confessions with the detailed accuracy the emperor required. He presented these requests not as attempts to save lives, but as opportunities to serve imperial justice more efficiently. Michael's response to John's offer revealed the psychological complexity underlying his reign of terror. The emperor was simultaneously delighted and suspicious, gratified by this ultimate submission from his youngest brother while paranoid about potential deception. He agreed to John's participation, but under conditions that demonstrated his continuing distrust. John would be chained to a wall during all torture sessions, close enough to assist but unable to interfere with imperial procedures. He would be required to participate in the infliction of pain, proving his loyalty through shared cruelty. Most significantly, he would be subjected to random torture sessions himself, reminders that his privileged position as assistant could be revoked at any moment. The first torture session John attended as Michael's assistant involved their 15-year-old cousin, Nikephoros, whose only crime had been inheriting their grandfather's distinctive nose and chin. The boy had been arrested on suspicion of plotting against the emperor, a charge based entirely on an overheard conversation in which he had expressed sympathy for Constantine's fate. As John watched Michael work with scientific precision to extract confessions from their terrified relative, he understood that he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history. This was not the random violence of a madman or the calculated brutality of a tyrant. This was systematic, methodical, almost ritualistic torture that served psychological needs far beyond political control. Michael had developed elaborate ceremonies around each session, specific prayers he recited before beginning, particular instruments he used in predetermined sequences, precise phrases he repeated while inflicting different types of pain. The emperor had transformed torture from crude interrogation technique into something resembling religious observance, with himself as both high priest and congregation. John's role in these ceremonies evolved gradually from simple assistance to active participation. Michael required him to hold instruments, to apply pressure at specific moments, to ask particular questions that would elicit desired responses from the subjects. Initially, John performed these tasks with visible reluctance, forcing himself to comply out of fear for his own survival. But as weeks passed and the sessions continued, something disturbing began to happen. The reluctance faded, replaced by a growing fascination with the emperor's techniques and their psychological effects. This transformation didn't occur through any conscious decision on John's part. It was more subtle, more insidious, like the gradual erosion of shoreline under persistent waves. Each act of participation made the next one easier. Each moment of shared cruelty created deeper bonds between the brothers. Each successful interrogation generated feelings of accomplishment and power that had been absent from John's life since childhood. He was discovering that collaboration with absolute evil could produce its own twisted form of satisfaction. The psychological dynamics between Michael and John during this period resembled nothing so much as a master craftsman, training his most promising apprentice. The emperor began sharing the philosophical frameworks he had developed to justify his actions, explaining how the systematic elimination of potential threats served the greater good of imperial stability. He described the torture techniques he had perfected as contributions to human knowledge, methods that might someday be used to extract vital information from foreign spies or enemy agents. Michael also began confiding his long-term vision for the Byzantine Empire, plans that required the complete transformation of traditional family structures and social relationships. He envisioned a society where loyalty flowed exclusively toward the emperor, where no competing bonds of kinship or friendship could challenge imperial authority. The torture and elimination of his own relatives served as both practical steps toward this goal and symbolic demonstrations of the new order he intended to create. John found himself genuinely captivated by these conversations, drawn into intellectual discussions about power, control, and human nature that revealed the sophisticated mind underlying his brother's monstrous actions. The emperor was not simply a sadist indulging psychological compulsions. He was a visionary attempting to reshape human civilization according to principles that, however horrifying in practice, possess their own internal logic and consistency. This intellectual seduction proved more dangerous to John's soul than any physical threat could have been. Physical torture might have broken his body while leaving his moral center intact, but the gradual corruption of his thinking created changes that went much deeper. He began to see their victims not as innocent relatives, but as obstacles to imperial progress. He started viewing their confessions not as products of unbearable pain, but as revelations of genuine guilt that had been hidden beneath masks of family loyalty. The final stage of John's transformation occurred when Michael offered him the opportunity to conduct an interrogation independently, to demonstrate the skills he had learned through months of careful observation and participation. The subject was their 12-year-old nephew Alexios, Constantine's son, who had been arrested for the crime of resembling his deceased father too closely. As John prepared the instruments and arranged the restraints according to his brother's exacting specifications, he realized that he was no longer the terrified prince who had once hidden in servants' quarters and dreamed of escape. The boy's screams that filled the torture chamber that night carried a different quality than those that had echoed through the palace during previous sessions. They were the cries of a child being destroyed not by a monster, but by someone who had once been human, who had once possessed the capacity for love and mercy, who had surrendered those qualities in exchange for survival and power. John had become something far more dangerous than Michael had ever been. He had become a willing participant in evil, a conscious collaborator who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. As young Alexios' life ebbed away under John's methodical attention, the last member of the imperial family to maintain any connection to human decency died as well. The palace dungeons had claimed not just the bodies of Constantine and Andronikos, but the souls of both their surviving brothers. Michael had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of human cruelty. He had not only tortured his siblings to death, but had corrupted the survivor so completely that the victim had become indistinguishable from the victimizer. The Byzantine Empire that emerged from this familial apocalypse bore no resemblance to the civilization that had once preserved classical learning, created magnificent art, and maintained the last connection between the ancient and medieval worlds. Under Michael VII's reign, Constantinople became a city where trust was treason, where love was weakness, where the only safe emotion was fear. The emperor and his willing accomplice had succeeded in creating their vision of perfect imperial control, a society where no relationship could challenge their absolute authority, because they had systematically destroyed the human capacity for genuine relationship itself. The palace servants developed their own methods for surviving in this transformed world. They learned to move through the corridors with downcast eyes, never making direct contact with either emperor or his brother accomplice. They perfected the art of selective deafness, training themselves to ignore the sounds that drifted from the lower levels during the long nights when imperial justice was being administered. Most importantly, they mastered the delicate balance between knowing enough to avoid dangerous mistakes and knowing so little that they couldn't be considered threats requiring elimination. Maria Cantacuzenius, the Empress Dowager's former lady-in-waiting, left behind a diary that provides chilling insight into daily life during this period of imperial madness. Her entries, written in a cipher she had learned from a former lover who served as a diplomatic secretary, document the psychological atmosphere that pervaded every corner of the palace. She describes servants who had begun speaking exclusively in whispers, not from any conscious decision, but because normal conversation had become impossible in an environment where every word might be reported, analyzed, and used as evidence of disloyalty. The transformation extended beyond mere caution into genuine psychological trauma that affected the entire household. Kitchen staff reported nightmares that left them unable to prepare meals containing red sauces, the color triggering memories of stains they had been ordered to clean from dungeon floors. Guards assigned to the palace's upper levels developed nervous tics, involuntary flinching responses that occurred whenever they heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the torture chambers. Even the palace cats, those ancient companions of Byzantine court life, began avoiding certain sections of the building entirely, their animal instincts recognizing something fundamentally wrong with those spaces. But perhaps most disturbing was the effect Michael's reign had on the empire's children. A generation of young nobles grew up understanding that family bonds offered no protection against imperial wrath, that blood relationships could become death sentences rather than sources of support. These children learned to view their siblings not as allies but as potential rivals, their parents not as protectors but as political liabilities whose mistakes might doom entire bloodlines. The emperor had successfully weaponized childhood itself, turning every nursery in the empire into a training ground for paranoia and betrayal. The corruption spread outward from the palace like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Provincial governors, understanding that Michael's methods might be applied to any level of the imperial hierarchy, began preemptively eliminating their own relatives who might pose theoretical threats to their positions. Military commanders started viewing their own officers through the lens of suspicion, conducting loyalty tests that often involved forcing subordinates to participate in activities that compromised their moral integrity. Merchants and craftsmen found themselves denouncing competitors to imperial investigators, not from genuine belief in their guilt, but from fear that failing to provide information might be interpreted as complicity. The economic consequences of this systematic paranoia proved nearly as devastating as the human cost. Trade relationships that had sustained Constantinople's prosperity for centuries began dissolving as merchants from other regions grew reluctant to conduct business in a city where commercial disputes might escalate into accusations of treason. The skilled craftsmen who had created the empire's legendary luxury goods fled to Venice, Genoa, and other Italian cities where their talents could be employed without the constant threat of political persecution. Even the tax collection system began breaking down as collectors found themselves unable to distinguish between legitimate administrative challenges and potential acts of rebellion. Michael seemed genuinely puzzled by the empire's declining fortunes, unable to understand how his perfection of imperial control could produce anything but greater prosperity and stability. He commissioned extensive studies by court economists and military analysts, seeking explanations for the mysterious problems that plagued every aspect of imperial administration. When these experts suggested that perhaps the emperor's domestic policies were contributing to the empire's difficulties, they quickly found themselves subjects of the same investigative procedures that had claimed so many members of the imperial family. The emperor's solution to these mounting challenges revealed the final evolution of his psychological pathology. Having successfully eliminated all threats within his own bloodline, having corrupted his surviving brother into willing collaboration, having terrorized the palace staff into absolute submission, Michael began expanding his definition of family to encompass the entire population of the Byzantine Empire. If systematic torture had proven effective for controlling his relatives, surely the same methods could be applied to managing his subjects on a larger scale. The infrastructure necessary for this expansion already existed in the form of the imperial bureaucracy that had administered the empire for centuries. Michael simply redirected its purposes, transforming tax collectors into informants, judges into interrogators, and regional administrators into torture specialists. The same governmental mechanisms that had once collected revenues, maintained roads, and defended borders were systematically converted into instruments for detecting and eliminating disloyalty throughout the empire's territories. John's role in this expansion proved crucial, demonstrating how completely his corruption had progressed. The youngest brother, once terrified of his own survival, now traveled throughout the empire as Michael's personal representative, establishing torture centers in major cities and training local officials in the refined techniques he had mastered under the emperor's tutelage. His transformation from victim to victimizer was so complete that provincial populations who had never heard of the palace horrors welcomed him as a savior, believing that imperial attention to their regions represented renewed commitment to effective governance. The training programs John established in cities like Thessalonica, Trebizond, and Nicaea became models of systematic brutality that would influence interrogation techniques for centuries to come. He had learned not just Michael's specific methods, but the underlying principles that made them effective. The psychological insights that allowed torture to serve purposes far beyond simple information extraction. Under John's guidance, regional administrators discovered how pain could be calibrated to produce specific behavioral changes, how fear could be weaponized to create voluntary compliance, how the systematic destruction of human dignity could serve as a tool for social control. The brothers' correspondence during this period, preserved in the imperial archives and discovered only during the 19th century, reveals the intellectual framework they had developed to justify their actions. Their letters read like treatises on political philosophy, sophisticated analyses of power dynamics that cite classical authors and contemporary scholars, while describing techniques for breaking human spirits with scientific precision. Michael and John had convinced themselves that they were pioneers in the field of governance, innovators whose methods would eventually be recognized as contributions to human knowledge. This self-perception as scholars rather than monsters allowed them to document their activities with meticulous care, creating detailed records that would horrify and fascinate historians for centuries to come. Michael's personal journals include precise measurements of pain thresholds, careful observations about the relationship between physical torture and psychological breakdown, and theoretical discussions about the application of these findings to broader questions of imperial administration. He had transformed his palace torture chamber into a laboratory for studying human nature under extreme stress, generating data that he believed would inform more effective methods of governance. The emperor's scientific approach to cruelty extended to experimentation with different torture techniques on subjects selected according to carefully controlled variables. He would test the same method on victims of different ages, social backgrounds, and physical conditions, recording variations in their responses and analyzing patterns that might reveal fundamental truths about human psychology. These experiments were conducted with the same methodical attention to detail that contemporary scholars applied to studies of astronomy, mathematics, or natural philosophy. John's contributions to this research program focused particularly on the long-term effects of systematic torture on community behavior. During his travels throughout the empire, he established control groups of populations that were subjected to different intensities of imperial attention, then monitored their responses over extended periods. His reports to Michael included statistical analyses of compliance rates, productivity measurements, and assessments of social cohesion that read like modern sociological studies conducted by demons rather than scholars. The most chilling aspect of these documents is their tone of genuine intellectual curiosity, combined with complete moral blindness. Both brothers wrote about their victims with the same detached interest that a botanist might show toward plant specimens, noting individual variations and unusual responses without any apparent recognition that they were describing the destruction of human beings. They had achieved a level of psychological dissociation that allowed them to commit unprecedented atrocities while maintaining their self-image as rational investigators pursuing important knowledge. The empire's religious establishment struggled to respond to this systematic perversion of imperial authority. The Orthodox Church had traditionally supported strong emperors as necessary for maintaining social order and defending Christian territories against Muslim invasion. But Michael's methods challenged fundamental theological principles about human dignity, family relationships, and the proper exercise of divinely granted power. Patriarch John VIII Xiphilinos found himself caught between his duty to support legitimate imperial authority and his obligation to condemn behavior that violated every principle of Christian ethics. The Patriarch's attempts to influence Michael through private consultation and public homily proved completely ineffective, largely because the emperor had developed his own theological framework that justified his actions as necessary for protecting the empire that God had entrusted to his care. Michael argued that his torture of family members demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice personal relationships for the greater good of Christian civilization, that his elimination of potential threats showed proper stewardship of the divine authority invested in imperial office. He had transformed his psychological compulsions into religious obligations, making himself impervious to criticism based on Christian moral teachings. When Patriarch John attempted more direct intervention by refusing to perform certain court ceremonies and withholding communion from palace officials who participated in torture activities, Michael responded with characteristic ruthlessness. The Patriarch found himself subjected to the same investigative procedures that had claimed so many others, accused of corresponding with foreign enemies and undermining imperial authority during a time of military crisis. The torture sessions conducted in the Patriarch's case were particularly elaborate, designed not just to extract confessions but to demonstrate the emperor's power over the most sacred figures in Byzantine society. The destruction of Patriarch John marked a turning point in the empire's spiritual as well as political life. Michael appointed a replacement who proved willing to provide theological justification for any imperial policy, no matter how extreme. The new patriarch, Cosmas I of Doukas, delivered sermons that praised the emperor's methods as divinely inspired techniques for purifying the empire of hidden corruption. Under his leadership, the Orthodox Church became an active participant in the systematic torture and elimination of anyone deemed disloyal to imperial authority. This religious sanctification of imperial torture created a feedback loop that accelerated the empire's moral collapse. Citizens who might have resisted the emperor's policies on grounds of Christian conscience found themselves without spiritual leadership or institutional support. The Church's endorsement of Michael's methods eliminated the last potential source of organized opposition to his reign of terror, leaving individual subjects with no alternative but submission or death. The international consequences of the Byzantine Empire's transformation under Michael VII proved equally devastating. Diplomatic relationships that had sustained the empire's position in the complex web of Mediterranean politics began dissolving as foreign courts grew reluctant to maintain formal ties with a regime that had become synonymous with systematic brutality. The Venetian Doge suspended commercial agreements that had enriched both empires for generations, citing concerns about the safety of Venetian merchants operating in Byzantine territories. The Pope in Rome began exploring possibilities for military intervention to restore legitimate government in Constantinople. Viewing Michael's regime as a threat to Christian civilization itself, these diplomatic tensions created opportunities for the empire's military enemies that proved impossible to ignore. The Seljuk Turks, still flush with victory from their triumph at Manzikert, recognized that Byzantine internal chaos offered perfect conditions for territorial expansion. The Norman adventurers who had been establishing themselves in southern Italy saw chances to claim Byzantine possessions that were no longer effectively defended. Even the Bulgarian and Serbian tribes that had traditionally feared Byzantine military power began conducting raids across the empire's northern borders, sensing weakness behind the facade of imperial terror. Michael's response to these external threats revealed how completely his obsession with internal control had distorted his understanding of imperial responsibilities. Rather than addressing the military challenges that threatened the empire's survival, he became convinced that the problems were caused by insufficient loyalty among his own subjects. Foreign defeats, he reasoned, could only occur if domestic traders were providing information and assistance to enemy forces. The solution was not better military strategy or diplomatic negotiation, but more thorough investigation and elimination of the disloyal elements within Byzantine society. This circular logic led to an escalation of domestic terror that made the earlier persecution of the imperial family seem restrained by comparison. Michael ordered comprehensive loyalty investigations for every resident of Constantinople, requiring citizens to provide detailed information about their associates, their private conversations, and their personal opinions about imperial policies. Those who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for these investigations found themselves subjected to interrogation procedures that had been refined through years of experimentation on higher profile victims. The emperor's demand for absolute loyalty from every subject created impossible standards that no normal human being could meet. Citizens were expected to report suspicious behavior by their neighbors, while simultaneously demonstrating trust and cooperation with those same neighbors. They were required to show enthusiasm for imperial policies, while avoiding the appearance of excessive ambition that might suggest personal political aspirations. Most challenging of all, they needed to display genuine emotional attachment to an emperor, whose actions had made genuine emotion impossible for anyone who understood the true nature of his regime. John's role in implementing these expanded loyalty requirements demonstrated how completely his moral transformation had progressed. The brother who had once hidden in servants' quarters to avoid imperial attention now conducted public ceremonies designed to test the sincerity of popular support for Michael's policies. These events, held in Constantinople's hippodrome and other public spaces, required citizens to participate in rituals of submission that grew increasingly elaborate and degrading over time. The most notorious of these ceremonies involved the renewal of imperial love, a monthly gathering where randomly selected citizens were required to demonstrate their emotional attachment to the emperor through increasingly intimate displays of devotion. Participants might be ordered to kiss imperial portraits with passion that satisfied observing officials, to weep genuine tears while describing their gratitude for imperial protection, or to express their willingness to sacrifice family members for the emperor's benefit in terms that convinced trained interrogators of their sincerity. Citizens who failed to meet the emotional standards demanded by these ceremonies faced immediate investigation for disloyalty, while those who performed too convincingly risked suspicion of theatrical deception designed to mask treasonous intentions. The impossible nature of these requirements ensured that every ceremony produced new victims for the empire's expanding torture infrastructure, creating a self-perpetuating system that fed on the population's growing terror and desperation. The psychological impact of living under these conditions transformed Byzantine society in ways that extended far beyond political compliance. Families stopped having private conversations, understanding that any statement might be reported by children who had been trained to monitor their parents' loyalty. Friendships became impossible as social relationships carried too much risk of guilt by association. Even romantic love became dangerous as emotional bonds between individuals might be seen as competing with loyalty to the emperor. Constantinople, once famous throughout the Mediterranean world for its vibrant social life and cultural sophistication, became a city of strangers living in proximity but maintaining careful isolation from one another. The coffee houses, bathhouses, and marketplaces that had once served as centers of community life grew silent except for the minimum conversation necessary for conducting essential business. Citizens developed elaborate systems of nonverbal communication that allowed them to exchange basic information without risking accusations of conspiracy or sedition. The empire's children, growing up in this environment of systematic paranoia, developed psychological profiles that would have been unrecognizable to previous generations of Byzantines. They learned to suppress emotional expression, understanding that displays of joy, anger, or sadness might be interpreted as political statements requiring investigation. They mastered techniques of social camouflage that allowed them to appear normal while maintaining the constant vigilance necessary for survival in a society where any behavior might be considered suspicious. These children also internalized the empire's new moral framework with a completeness that their parents, raised under different conditions, could never achieve. For them, the systematic torture of suspected traitors was simply a normal part of governmental administration, no more remarkable than tax collection or military service. They developed genuine enthusiasm for the loyalty ceremonies and investigation procedures that terrorized their elders, seeing participation in these activities as opportunities for advancement rather than sources of trauma. The long-term implications of this generational transformation would extend far beyond Michael's reign, creating a population psychologically adapted to authoritarian control in ways that would influence Byzantine political culture for centuries to come. The emperor and his brother had succeeded in engineering not just temporary compliance, but fundamental changes in human nature itself, producing citizens who were incapable of conceiving alternatives to the system that oppressed them. As Michael's reign entered its seventh year, the accumulated weight of domestic terror and external pressure began producing effects that even the emperor's sophisticated methods of control could not manage. The empire's population had been reduced by warfare, persecution, and emigration to levels that made normal economic activity impossible. The skilled craftsmen, merchants, and administrators whose expertise had sustained Byzantine prosperity for generations had either fled to other countries or been eliminated as potential security threats. The remaining population consisted largely of individuals whose primary qualification was their ability to survive in an environment of systematic brutality. The agricultural systems that had fed Constantinople for centuries began failing as farmers abandoned their fields, rather than risk accusations of insufficient productivity. The complex irrigation networks that had sustained Byzantine agriculture since Roman times fell into disrepair when the engineers who maintained them were investigated for potential sabotage and never returned to their work. Entire regions that had once exported grain to other parts of the Mediterranean world could no longer feed their own populations, creating refugee crises that strained the empire's remaining administrative capacity. Michael's response to these cascading failures revealed the final stage of his psychological evolution from emperor to something beyond human comprehension. He became convinced that the empire's problems stemmed from insufficient application of his proven methods rather than from the methods themselves. If torture had successfully eliminated threats within his family, if fear had created compliance among his subjects, if systematic brutality had maintained his authority for 7 years, then clearly the solution to current difficulties was more torture, greater fear, and expanded brutality applied with even greater precision and scope. In the end, Michael VII Doukas achieved something no tyrant before or since has managed. He didn't just destroy his enemies or terrorize his subjects, he eliminated the very concept of human love from an entire civilization, replacing it with a fear so complete that it rewrote the fundamental code of human nature itself. The screams that once echoed through those marble corridors have long since faded, but their echoes still whisper to us across the centuries, reminding us that the greatest monsters in history aren't born. They're made by the choices we make when power becomes more important than humanity.